Hello and welcome. This is Kelly Fitzpatrick with RedMonk here with another What is How To video. I have two guests with me today, Zach and James. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and Zach, we will start with you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Zach Robinson. I'm a product manager working with VMware on the Tanzu application platform. And specifically, I've been working with Supply Chain Choreographer, which is a part of our platform.
Welcome. And James?
Hi, thanks, Kelly. So I'm James Rawlings. I also work in VMware. I'm a tech lead working in the same program as Zach, working on Tanzu application platform, also working with Supply Chain Choreography.
Well, welcome to you as well. So our topic today, what is supply chain choreography? How to get started with Cartographer. That's quite the mouthful. But I think the area that I want to kind of start with is the idea of supply chain. This is a term that in kind of greater, larger, more general parlance, we have heard everywhere. Like, it's the reason I can't get a specific thing I want at the grocery store, whether it's like cream cheese or the specific brand of toilet paper I want. But also in kind of more tech circles, we've also heard this term, very closely coupled with security. So supply chain security has come up a lot, especially talking about a lot of security vulnerability issues that have been, kind of in the news lately. So to start us off, can you tell us a little bit about what you mean when you say supply chain in this context?
Yeah. So when we're talking about supply chains, what we're really talking about is, when you have a developer in your organization building software, they've got source code. How does that ultimately get running and become available to your end users, right? There's some sort of what we call a path to production that gets you there. And this is your supply chain, right? And so I've got to take my source code and ultimately I want to build it. I want to test it. I want to, get it versioned and running somewhere. Maybe I need to run security scans on it. So all of those pieces that help you actually go from, hey, I've got some raw source code, to at the end of the day, I'm providing value to my end users. I've got a running product somewhere. All of the tools and steps you take along the way, that's your supply chain.
Cool. That sounds very ordered.
Yeah. And so the choreography part, of course, is sort of the mechanism we'll talk about of how we sort of handle supply chains within the platform. So let me jump in a little bit and I'll sort of share what we see as sort of the problem as it exists today and why we built a solution around supply chain choreography. And specifically, we're a tool that works on top of Kubernetes, right? And the Kubernetes ecosystem is just fantastic. There's so many projects out there, and they tackle all these different parts of your supply chain, whether that's doing continuous integration, whether that's building images, or running deployments either directly on Kubernetes or with there's a lot of cool runtimes out there, Knative, where you can get auto scale and runtimes, things like this. These are all parts and pieces that you sort of interact with in this Kubernetes landscape. And they're all part of your supply chain. They're part of your life cycle of how you get your source running there. And each one of these little pieces, you have different folks in your organization that care about different parts of these. As a developer, I care about my source code and getting some tests run on it, make sure it's working right. As a DevOps person, I care about, how am I doing continuous deployment? How is this running in production? Am I meeting compliance? And of course, you have security folks that are saying, hey, where the heck did this thing come from? If you run a security scan on it, what are the dependencies you're layering into this, right? And so when you look at the Kubernetes ecosystem, you've got tools for all this, but the way you sort of put them together, it's a little windy path that everyone sort of has to figure out, their little piece of this pie. So lots of assembly required is kind of what we think about there.
And I love that this slide right here, the one with the kind of, or the one you were just on. I love that slide and I imagine it, but instead of just seeing these nice little pieces, I'm thinking of the CNCF's kind of landscape map and
exactly.
trying to draw these connections through all that as well. So I feel like this is good at demonstrating how chaotic these can be, but is like too kind in terms of it being much more organized than I can imagine things being for people in real life.
Yeah, that exactly, that CNCF poster is exactly what we think about, right? That entire list of projects and, who's an expert in every one of those, right? Well, no one, right? Someone's an expert in this area, someone's an expert in this area. And, how do you pull those all together and get them sort of working for you, right? And so that's sort of the challenge we see. And I think a lot of organizations are facing this. We've said, well, we'd like to have a solution that sort of, what's the missing glue here? Can we have something that actually pulls these together and gives you, a codified understanding and visibility into what is my path to production, what is my supply chain, right? And so now I see that I can kind of take some tooling and start putting together what is my continuous integration tool of choice? How am I building images? Where am I storing those images? And ultimately, how am I deploying these and getting these running? And so that's the idea of where this supply chain choreography comes in, is how do I take the existing tools in this ecosystem and start fitting them together into something that makes sense for me and something that makes it feel like a holistic, comprehensive platform that actually lets me get my workloads running in production instead of me chasing all of these little puzzle pieces and trying to stick them together. And so for that, we've sort of generated a project that we call Cartographer. This is an open source project created by VMware. And it is how we power what we call supply chain choreography. And so we've done sort of looking at that problem, we've said, how do we pull out the things that each of the personas in your org care about, whether that's developers, DevOps, or security operations? How do we give them an interface into the system? And how do we make it configurable? So in that big landscape of all these tools, I can pick and choose, I can pick the right ones and combine them together into a coherent supply chain, a coherent path to production. And that's sort of what you start seeing sort of fall out here a little bit. And so we've sort of got, in an ideal world, what we'd like to have is a whole bunch of developers. In this case, somehow they're all named Scott, an army of Scotts, but they're working on many different applications. And what they get is an actual API interface. This is part of Cartographer that we call a workload. And this is how you describe, to the system, what do I want to do with my running workload? How do I describe my application? And that's what I want to focus on as a developer. I want to describe my application and I want to point at some source code and I want to start iterating on source. I don't want to think about all of those components and that whole path to production and all of that. For that, I've got people in my organization that really care about that. And that's my DevOps and my security ops folks. And so you can see there, they sort of target what we call a supply chain. And this, again, is an API resource as part of Cartographer. So this is something you can really define as a DevOps person or a SecOps person. And we see these little components in here, right? And so those are those puzzle pieces we think about putting together. And so what this really means is we've got an API that defines your supply chain. So ultimately, as an operator, you can decide what this path to production looks like for your organization. You can choose the tools you want out of that Kubernetes ecosystem and put together. And what you start seeing is all of these workloads can run through a single supply chain. They get consistency because they're using the same tools every time. And they get speed, right? The developer is not thinking about every step along the way. Well, which tool do I grab this time? If I'm Scott on the left here, I have to, worry about these 4 tools in my supply chain. And if I'm Scott on the right, I got to worry about the same thing. No, I don't have to think about that. I just put it into the system and let it do it for me. And ultimately stamp out all of these running apps. And so, what you start seeing here is supply chains are really something everyone's already familiar with, right? Whether you've been doing this on app platforms today, think of Heroku, right? They actually give you a little bit of a supply chain. I run a build pack, I build my source and I deploy and run it, or App Engine, those sorts of tools, or even just what you see a lot of people sort of building, lots of CI and CD pipelines kind of individually and sort of putting those out for applications. Those are supply chains. What we're saying is put them all together into Cartographer, define them programmatically with this API. And it's a little different now than those sort of closed black box sort of app platforms you've seen in the past, right? If you're using something like a Heroku or an App Engine, whatever they've decided your supply chain is, that's it. That is what it is. You don't get a choice, right? Well, here we're saying, let's expose that as an API. And so ultimately now that black box opens up and you get to build your own app platform.
And this definitely fits with a larger trend that we're seeing in terms of the relationship between, say, ops teams or even platform teams is another kind of emerging kind of group or team that we're seeing in organizations where, so your ops team and your platform team kind of curating these choices and options and ways for like tools for developers to use, and then developers kind of not having to make like all of those decisions every time they're trying to decide what to do, what part of, their app development they happen to be at.
Exactly. Yeah, we've seen people want to do that. They want to put their own opinions in. And what's really great here is you sort of see, you get this leverage because, right, we see a whole pile of workloads coming into a single supply chain and stamping out applications. But because this is an API you can apply to your system, there's no reason you can't have more than one supply chain, right? I can have one that works for my web type applications, or if I've got custom batch type applications, and I want to choose some different tools out of that Kubernetes ecosystem, I'll build a supply chain that combines those together. And now I've got these two really consistent, very fast paths to production, where I know everything that's happening in them, and I've got the right tools for that specific type of workload.
And I think that flexibility is also important there. So we've talked a bit about supply chains. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between, say, orchestration and choreography?
Yes, perfect. That's exactly what I want to talk about next. So supply chain choreographer, we talked a lot about supply chains. What is this choreography piece, right? And I've even mentioned it a little bit, like, you see people using tools, maybe something like a Jenkins. Think of that as an orchestrator, where you're sort of building out your sort of codified pipeline. When I get a source code commit, I run these tests. If the test passes, I write this image, right? That is a supply chain. What's happening there, though, is a tool like Jenkins works as what we call an orchestrator. Every signal is something that Jenkins gets, and Jenkins then manages all of your little pieces along the way to make sure they sort of flow together. What we're doing with choreography is a little different, right? What we're saying is, like we talked about in the Kubernetes ecosystem, there's lots of these sharp tools that are focused on solving one piece of your supply chain, whether that's image building or running with something like Knative or doing CI with Tekton. And what we don't want to do is have an orchestrator trying to tell each of those how to do its job. We want to let those tools do what they're great at, right? And so what it really means is that the choreographer knows how to watch for signals from those systems. And upon seeing those signals, pass along information, give signals to other systems, which means that ultimately the tools you're choreographing just do what they want to do. And so the example I kind of have here is this, like, hey, there's a new CVE, I need to do some new security scanning. And typically with like a Jenkins type pipeline, I might have updated my security scan rules to know about this new CVE, but I have to, from the outside, trigger this orchestrator to do its job. In a typical pipeline, that might be make a git commit, right? And then I have to run tests. And now I get my security scan. And I'm like, I didn't want to wait for all that. I have this thing. I need to do my scanning now, right? Well, when you're doing choreography, what you get to do is work with your security scanning tool. So update its rules. It has updated rules. It starts scanning. Upon scanning, if it has results, this is a signal that the choreographer can look for, and it can respond to that signal, whether that's, hey, everything is good, let's keep moving forward, or I need to throw up a red flag because I've seen something go bad. So the choreographer really works in a way where it's sending signals and sort of helping all these tools work together, letting the tools do the job they do best. So I'll do a quick sort of in practice, but we actually have a demo coming up. So just to sort of set the stage for that a little bit, we sort of talked about what is choreography, what's a supply chain. Well, let's look at a basic one and how we pull some of these personas in, right? At its most basic, if you're deploying an app to Kubernetes, the flow looks a lot like this for a developer, right? I come up with my idea, I write some code. Now I'm prepping a Docker file, right? I'm building an image. I'm pushing that image to a registry somewhere. I'm describing to Kubernetes how to use that image, how to describe my deployment. Then there's this always fun, my DevOps team is telling me I didn't quite put everything together right. So now I'm going to figure out how to do that. Let me put in my best practices. You ultimately have to configure your ingress, and then eventually I get to apply this to Kubernetes and I run, right? And this container orchestration has been really powerful, right? People like this, but it's a lot for a developer to look at, right? To think about, why do I have to build my file, my Docker file? Why do I have to pull in these best practices for my DevOps folks? They already know this. How do I codify this thing? Right. And so that's what we're saying is take the steps to start really pulling this out, where a developer can focus on what they want. I can ideate, I can code, and ultimately I can tell the system I have a new workload. And then the supply chain becomes that opinionated piece that knows how to apply the best practices to all of my resources. Whether maybe I need to put a health check on every one of my workloads in a certain way. Right. And so the developer, their persona now gets to focus on this thing, but we have a supply chain doing sort of the nitty gritty work, but it's hidden away from the developer. But the details of that are super important, right? Your DevOps folks, and especially your security ops folks, they really care about that. And so within this supply chain, let's start putting together some of the pieces. So concretely, we sort of have examples here. We know the developer is pushing to a Git repository, so we want to watch that. Whenever we see changes to our Git repository, let's do code scanning. Let's bring security into this story, right? It's not just Docker build a file and run it on a deployment. Let's expand that supply chain to start encompassing more of your tooling. Let's run some tests, build that image, and ultimately generate the K8s config with best practices, because you can codify that into the supply chain. So now if I need to make sure I'm putting a health check into every workload, I can do that. And so now your DevOps and SecOps folk get to really own this piece of it, right? And now you have this really nice way where developers have a nice view into the system where they're providing their workloads and their source code. And your DevOps and security ops folks have their view into the system in terms of how they really care about it. of defining the supply chain, making sure the compliance there, the best practices are there. And, they're both now working within the same system. So you get a lot of consistency and speed and visibility into what's happening.
Excellent. I think that was a great overview, but I believe we were promised a demo as well. And for that, I think for that, we're heading off to James.
Okay, thanks, Zach. So we're going to switch over to practical example here. This is GitHub. As a developer, this is my interaction where I push my source code. I've got some code already being pushed up to a Git repository. You notice in here, there's no Docker file or pipeline defined in here. This is just the source code of my application that I want to be building. So this is me as a developer really just focusing on the source code. Now, just want to switch gears and switch to a Kubernetes cluster. So that as a developer, I was working on my source code, but as an application operator, I've already installed Tanzu application platform on the Kubernetes cluster. Inside Tanzu application platform, there is Cartographer. Zach's mentioned it already. He's talked about Tecton. There's also other tooling and services that are running inside the platform as well. Services for building an application, using build packs, and also scanning as well. Other things that over time from the Kubernetes ecosystem will evolve, more things will be added to this platform, and more capabilities we want to leverage. But as a developer, I want to focus on my code. So here we go. We've got a Tanzu apps workload create. So we're going to create our workload. This is a Cartographer workload. So let's go ahead and create that. Here we can see we've got the Git repository that we're interested, we've got the branch, we've got the type. It's a type of web, just gives a bit of an indication of what type of supply chain this should be using. And we've got a label that helps us to identify it. So let's create this. Now, this, as far as demos go, we don't want to focus too much on the YAML, but you can see here, this is just a vanilla Kubernetes custom resource definition, custom resource. So this has been created. We could run kubectl get workload. You should see that custom resource has been created. Yes, that's there. Now we're going to use the Tanzu CLI. Again, you could just use kubectl if you wanted to, but we're going to go in tail. Now, that workload, as we talked about before, that is the abstraction that a developer is working towards. Now what that workload has been created, the supply chain that as an app operator that I've defined the sequence for is going to start instructing what needs to happen with the changes to take that path through to production for that application. So it's going to, we've got KPack running as we said, so it's going to use a build pack to build a base image, it's going to push to a registry. It's also going to generate the Kubernetes manifest to be able to deploy and run that application. It's also going to do a promotion as well, because we're enabling GitOps out of the box here. And so we push the generated resources into a Git repository and then pull them back down and be able to run those. That also helps with the multi-cluster environment as well. Obviously, you want to be able to deploy your applications in different clusters. So that's really, as what's happening from a developer point of view, you can imagine as well, we're squirreling away, working hard to have a nice UX, to be able to get better insights. At a high level, this is what's happening from a developer point of view. But as an application operator, this really gives me the strength and the power to be able to start adding in, changing those policies, as providing governance and policies over my entire fleet of applications, thousands of applications. That really gives me the power to be able to have that consistency across all of that level. And that really is quite powerful, because if I want to change the policies, the levels of different CVEs being detected, I can make that change and then affect and trigger all these supply chains for all my applications that I'm aware of. So this is really taking the two personas from a developer point of view, just working with that abstraction of the workload, and the app operator really adding in that intelligence into the platform and building out those capabilities on security and automation. Now, as far as logs go, they're not terribly exciting, but what we can do here, I think, is probably kubectl get root. Now, we have a promotion which we promoted into a Git repository. That's now been pulled down as another part of Cartographer. We have our application, which is now running in that same namespace that I created the workload. You almost look like you were going to ask a question there, Kelly.
I always love when I love when there's minimal YAML in especially the developer part of a demo. So I like that very much. But then also we end up with an actual working app at the end. So thank you.
That's good. Yeah, well, and I think really that really goes to show where the power it comes from a developer point of view. Focusing on the source code, being able to not know how to necessarily the liveness checks we want, or any node affinity, or any other aspects of that running application within a Kubernetes environment. We don't necessarily need to know those things and how to build that, and having these from, if you could imagine, say these are the capabilities of building applications, or the building the images. If you've got, say, a log vulnerability, you might want to be able to disable across your entire fleet of applications using an environment variable. Then you can now do that using whatever the build tool that you are using. So what we want to do is be able to swap and interchange these parts in the supply chain using the innovation that's happening in the ecosystem of Kubernetes.
James, thank you. That was a very excellent, I think, very, very succinct and economical demo. Zach, do you have anything to add, or any other context that you want to leave people with to follow that demo?
Yeah, so that was great. Thanks, James. That sort of showed us that developer piece being really sort of simple. I just described my source code. And, the key thing to remember there is that supply chain we had, that's sort of an out of the box one that uses a bunch of Kubernetes ecosystem tools to just make that all magic and simple to happen. But like James said, you don't have to do it the way we did it. You can plug in your own sort of tools along the way. And so that was really showing the power of Cartographer. I sort of want to draw that together a little bit, some of the connections for folks, just so people can kind of see how we're actually using this at VMware. So we have Cartographer, this open source project, which hopefully people will come and collaborate with us on. I'll show some ways to get a hold of us on the next slide. But, we're using that, and we're using that as a capability within the Tanzu application platform. It's how we're providing our supply chain choreography story. And along with that, we're providing a bunch of supply chains out of the box that have these already good, what we think of as good practice path to productions. So you can get started right away in your organization. Or since we are providing the API of Cartographer along the way, you can sort of, mix and match and build your own. And ultimately, this is all part of Tanzu application platform, right? And so this is where we're trying to provide a superior developer experience on any Kubernetes, all of these great bullet points you see on the screen. But that second one, rapid yet sustainable path to production, that's where Cartographer is helping out and playing a big role.
Great. And you promised, here we go, some resources on where people can look to get more information or to get started with this tech.
Yeah, so to learn more about Tanzu application platform, follow the link here. So take you to our landing page. And if you're looking to get involved in Cartographer the OSS project, if you're interested in how you map these tools together or integrating with any tools in the Kubernetes ecosystem that you're working on or care about, you can check out our project page, which is here, and you can link up with us on Slack.
Cool. And we will include these links in the materials surrounding wherever you're watching this video, so you can hopefully just click on it instead of having to type stuff out. But this has been another RedMonk What Is How To, talking about supply chain choreography. I want to thank both of my guests very much for being here today. Zach, James, thank you. You've both been great.
Thanks, Kelly.